time. Okay. So welcome everybody to today's annual program. It's the 2023 STS Annual Program, which is exciting. Very happy to be here. Happy to have you all here, and hopefully we'll see some more people coming in as time goes on. This year we have the Issues in Science and Technology panel presentation on science and librarianship and social justice. I'm very excited to have everyone here speaking today. I think it will be a very, very interesting program to have. To get us started off, I do want to thank our program sponsor, IEEE. Thank you so very much for your generous sponsorship of today's program. Specifically, they are helping us live caption. We do have a live captioner today, so thank you so much for your sponsorship. Just a couple of housekeeping general announcements. We do ask, please keep the conversation respectful. We are following the ACRL Code of Conduct and the ALA Virtual Meeting Code of Conduct. Our Code of Conduct point person today is Rebecca Ranieri. If you think at any time somebody has breached the Code of Conduct, please feel free to reach out to her or reach out to me. We are super happy to address whatever issue you might have. Although, we also recognize that you all are a very wonderful group of people, so hopefully we don't have any issues. This meeting will be recorded and the video will be posted on the new-ish STS YouTube channel and on the STS LibGuide. Please keep yourself muted and your camera off unless you are called on to speak or ask a question. Obviously, this does not pertain to our speakers, but definitely for participants. You are encouraged to ask questions whenever you have them throughout the presentations. If you have them, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We do have a couple of chat moderators on board today, and so they will be looking for your questions. So please feel free to drop them in as they occur to you. Couple of special thanks. Our presenters, thank you so very much for being here. You all have been wonderful to work with, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation, so thank you very much. To all of our volunteer moderators, both in the chat today and as a Code of Conduct person. To SciNexus for helping us with the live captioning, and an extra special thank you to Kayla for our captioner today. And to viewers like you for participating. We have the annual program every year, but it keeps going on and it keeps being a wonderful program because of your support and your viewership. So thank you for being here. I also want to give a very heartfelt special thank you to the 2023 Program Planning Committee. All of you, your names are there, but you've been wonderful to work with through this, and I do really appreciate it. So thank you so very much for helping me and Rebecca. And an extra special thank you to Rebecca for being an awesome co-chair. So yeah, I appreciate it. Today's agenda, right now, 1 p.m. that's this panel presentation with the authors of the 4-part ISTL series. At 3 p.m. at the same Zoom link, we will have a second presentation by Lidia Ponce de la Vega. Please attend that if you can or if you want. I think that should also be another really great presentation. And again, the Zoom link is the same for both. Okay, now speaker introductions without too much further ado. And I am, let's see here, there we go. Okay, first up, we have Jeffra Bussmann, who is the science librarian working at a public medium-sized university. She is heavily embedded in the College of Science, participating in a variety of faculty learning opportunities and teaching information literacy in various science courses. Jeffra loves tabletop games, go tabletop games, and recently has been exploring how to use them to increase community building and a sense of belonging in the library. Isabel Altamirano is not here today. However, she is an author of the 4-part series, and so we definitely wanted to include her. She is the chemistry and chemical engineering librarian. She is restarting an old hobby, attending plays and dance recitals, which is super fun, and also likes to learn something new from everyone she meets. Sam Hansen is at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Sam is the mathematics and statistics librarian working at a large research focused university. Their focus is on mathematical communication, belonging and identity in mathematics, and the dynamics of citation aging, which is fascinating. I'd love to talk to you sometime about that. They also engage the broader mathematical sciences by working with the American Mathematical Society, the International Mathematical Union, and Spectra. When they are not in the library, you can likely find Sam riding their bike and listening to podcasts. Nastasha Johnson is at Purdue University and is an associate professor of library science at Purdue University's Libraries and School of Information Studies in West Lafayette, Indiana. She also serves as a provost fellow in the Office of the Provost, Division of Teaching and Learning, and an intercultural learning officer for the Center of Intercultural Learning, Mentoring, Assessment, and Research. As liaison to the Mathematics and Physics Department, she maintains the Mathematics Sciences Library and the Physics and Astronomy Library collection. Her research interests include faculty development and training, equity, diversity, and inclusion within STEM, and high impact educational practices. She joined Purdue University in 2013 after being a reference and instruction librarian at North Carolina A&T State University, and she is mom of 2 active sons. And last but certainly not least is Gr Keer, who is at California State University in East Bay. Gr is the Community Engagement and Outreach Librarian and Interim Chair of the Information Studies Department at Cal State East Bay in Hayward, California. As chair of the Library Curriculum and Instruction Committee, they led the effort to develop a new critical information studies minor that will launch in fall of 2023. Their research and professional interests include critical librarianship, disability justice, and how to use transformative justice practices to reduce and address the incidence of intra-library microaggressions. Gr is also a poet, which is wonderful. I wish we had time for poetry. Maybe next time. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to stop my share here. And I am going to pass it over to our panel.
Great. Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. We appreciate that. And I think that probably covers for our introductions. Does everyone agree? We're kind of good there? Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Jody. So I am going to start here. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about how this work began and where it sort of came from. There's a group called Stella that meets every couple of years, which some of you, hopefully all of you, know about. But if not, I will just put in the chat really quick where you can find a little bit more information. In particular, so this is Science, Technology, Engineering, Library Leaders in Action, an unconference. And when we met in 2018, the issues of social justice really started to rise up there. And while there were a few of the librarians who I would say were fairly, had quite a bit of knowledge and expertise and lived experience in this, a lot of enthusiasm and passion, there were many who were like, tell us more, like what, how, a great kind of craving for it. And I saw that sort of as an opportunity to do something. But it's also realized that there seemed to be a need for like a collective recognition of vocabulary, essentially. And the original people that I had discussed this idea with were unable to participate. So I started to be on the lookout for recruiting. And I was very fortunate when I started at Cal State East Bay to start with Gr. And Gr and I had been on a faculty learning community early on what was it? Civic engagement and social responsibility, I think was the name of it, something like that. Community engagement and social responsibility, something along those lines. And we learned quite a bit and did some very exciting things that we did together in our classes. And I knew they would have very unique and critical perspective to add. So I was like, hey, want to work with some science librarians? How does that sound to you? Fortunately, they said sure, and joined on. And then I knew that STS had an EDI committee, and I thought that some of those people might want to join in the work. And both Isabel and Nastasha agreed and joined into our group, and I was very grateful to have their presence as well. And Sam has worked with me in the Physics, Astronomy, Mathematics division in SLA, Special Libraries Association, and I knew they had a great passion for this. And I said, hey, wanna join on board? And they said yes too. So thank goodness. So that kind of formed our group, and that was, I believe, somewhere in 2019, and that kind of like started us off. We're all over the US, so we started meeting right away in Zoom. Some of us still have not met in person, and I will pass it on to, I believe, Nastasha. You'll carry on our story.
So as Jeffra mentioned, we began meeting immediately. From the previous work, there was a list of words, right? And we, did a bit of onboarding, getting to know each other, those types of things. But then we pretty much jumped right in. And we started discussing our list. We just started discussing how we wanted things to be formatted. And one of the things we immediately done was pitch. Right, we still had to make that pitch to ISTL, and from the beginning, we wanted to. We had a vision for the 4 series. We had a vision for the special issue. If anybody in here who submitted to that, thank you. So we had a vision for all the way back in 2019, which seems like 20 years ago, but nonetheless, we did the work, and from there we started thinking about how the best way to do, to work through these definitions. So our process is actually pretty interesting. We would divide each word into 2 or 3 people. You'd sign up for, we would have our list for our first column, have our list, we'll sign up. And then those 2 people would go individually, write definitions, and then we would bring it back to the group. So each and every word, each and every word we discussed and we diced and we argued and all the things about each and every word and each and every definition. So the definition started with 2 people, but it ended with all of us as a team agreeing on the language and agreeing not only with the definitions, but also the examples. So those, so those same 2 people will write out examples. As you may know, we had the science examples as well as the non-science or the library examples. And we literally went through them line by line. So again, Jeffra said 2019, it's 2023. That gives you a sense of how long it took for us to work through some of these lists. We started pre-COVID, we worked through COVID, and we just turned away at the list. And as you may know from our columns, it got increasingly more difficult, right? There was the beginning and then there was the end. And we really had to think about how we wanted to convey this message to the larger science community. So it's fun. We know each other pretty well. That's why we're all kind of casual. But it was a process. It was really a process where we actually were challenged to learn things about ourselves, learn things about libraries, and how we wanted to share our work with our colleagues. Sam?
Yes, all of that, very true. I do know these fine people very well now. And so, I mean, I want to talk a little bit more about how we actually did that editing process. So yeah, we would come in with 2 definitions, sometimes also some links and other things to share about them. And oftentimes, like the people writing the definitions also were not necessarily super expert on the exact topic. Sometimes they were. There were cases where that was true, where that someone had very strong lived experience around that definition, but that was not often true. So we were really like almost going through a process of like instantaneous peer review and group co-editing of things all at the same time. And there were words where sometimes we would have to stop in the middle of a time going through and be like, you know what, we're just gonna all have to do some reading and come back and discuss this word later. This is especially true with some of the later word says, because as Nastasha mentioned, they do scaffold on top of one another. And so they do get of increasing granularity and nuance. I think we can probably say. And as you might be able to imagine, this really meant that we were having hard conversations. Like we were having conversations that brought up traumas and various other emotional triggers for a lot of people in the room, and not the people at the exact same time as each other. And so we really had to be cognizant of what we're doing and like be willing to call each other in about like, maybe this is not the exact right time. Like you may need to expand your thought a little bit about this topic. Like this was my lived experience around this. And while those conversations were hard, I don't remember a single time any of us ever like argued. Like there was debate. There was plenty of debate over things. Yeah, Nastasha. Yeah, we definitely never disagreed more than this much on a definition. For those of you who are not currently laughing, Nastasha and I historically were disagreed on pretty much everything. And I remember like there was one meeting where we agreed on things and the other three people were like shocked and worried that the world was going to end at that moment. Then again, I think COVID did start soon after that, so we may have caused that by agreeing. And so there was just a lot of, and this also was part of the reason why it was important for us to get to know each other too. Like one of the reasons why these disagreements were like didn't get into like real interpersonal conflict was because we knew the other people. We had faith and understanding that they were coming from a good place and that they were willing to learn and change their minds. And I think we all quite regularly would say like, oh, I didn't understand that before. Thank you so much for letting me see that perspective on things. So like this whole project really, I mean, of course it expanded my mind. Like there's a lot of words I now know the definitions of I didn't know before, but it really, more than anything, it really showed me how to work with other people and how to allow my mind to change. Because, you know, I come from a math background. Generally, I know something and then I don't have to worry about my knowledge changing about that thing because it's proven, it's a theorem. And so being able to change my mind, I like that was just such a gift that my co-authors on this gave to me. And now that we've talked about all of this process stuff, Gr, would you like to share some definitions?
Sounds good. Yeah, so I'm running the slide deck here, so let's see if I can do this at the same time. And before I do that, I just want to say, you know, so I'm sort of the token social sciences person on this team, which was fun, actually. I was a little trepidatious about it at first because, you know, my undergraduate degree is in English literature. I'm really interested in social sciences. I have a lot of experience in that zone. And I also have a very sort of like community activism approach to social justice topics. And so it's slightly different than the academic approach. And so I was thinking, oh my gosh, like, how is this going to work? I don't know anything about science or science librarianship, really. But actually, it was very, yeah, it was, as Sam said, it was a very mind-opening experience. I really enjoyed hearing about the various ways that science librarians approach all sorts of things, you know, understanding of the world and that kind of stuff. So I learned a lot. And yeah, I really enjoyed working with all of my colleagues, even though I still have not met most of you in person yet. I know Jeffra very well, but yeah, so and of course, you know, when we were working through definitions, one of the thoughts that I kept coming back to was that definitions are really tricky, right? Because of course, there's a lot of nuance to most definitions. I can't even imagine trying to write a dictionary. Oh my gosh. But like when I felt like as soon as we wrote something down, you would notice what was missing, or it felt like it would change, right? Language is very fluid. There's a lot of, and also the thinking changes, right? We're always moving forward in our understanding of these concepts. And so it was a little scary to write them down and publish them and then have to hold the possibility that we'll look back and go, oh, but it's still really valuable. So what I have here for us is we have four and a half examples of definitions that kind of illustrate, as Sam mentioned, the scaffolding that we were working with. So the first definition comes from the first article, which we called foundational. And we tried to choose terms for the foundational piece that would give folks kind of a background for understanding the next few articles. So this is an example of one of them, which is dominant culture. I won't read the whole thing, but I did highlight here that our first sentence, which is a set of norms or practices that are considered to be superior by the culture that holds power through mechanisms such as traditions, laws, and or economics, and have been imposed by them onto other cultures and or subcultures, which are often seen as lower or subordinate. And of course, each one of these terms had some examples of how you might see this concept showing up in librarianship in general, and then in the sciences as well. So then when we move to the second article, which was called intermediate, microaggressions felt like maybe a step up from that, right? What happens to folks who inhabit marginalized positionalities? That's another word that's in our articles. What happens to folks, right? And one of the things is microaggressions, and their impact is felt in the cumulative effect of constant slights, misunderstandings, and messages that the targeted person is different, less respected, less important, right? Less part of the dominant culture. So you can start to see how these fit together. And the third article is called Advanced. We had a lot of fun trying to name the articles. We were like, what schema should we use? Like, how does this fit together? So this one is code switching, right? So this is how one navigates institutional or dominant cultures and spaces through shifts in language and expression. And we pointed out that members of non-dominant groups are expected to, and often need to, for safety or professional reasons, conform to the norms and expectations of language and expression when in a dominant group space. And you can also see that as we went through, since the concepts got more complicated, the definitions got longer. Which is very much evidenced by this one, which is two parts, it's 2 slides in our capstone article. And that is epistemic violence, right? So how those who are positioned as quote unquote other by colonial powers have their ability to speak for and about themselves and to make knowledge claims subjugated, which comes from Spivak. And then the second part of that, right? So we had a really long discussion about this one, about epistemic violence versus epistemic injustice. We learned a ton. I know all 5 of us were kind of like, whoa, this is, as Sam mentioned, when we had to go away and read, this was the one that really sticks out in my mind, where we had to go away and be like, okay, there's so much work that's been done about these concepts. And it turns out that they're different. Epistemic violence and epistemic injustice. Epistemic violence came first. Epistemic injustice is defined as the silencing, distrusting, misrepresentation, and subordination of the knowledge and ways of knowing of minoritized, marginalized, and other non-dominant groups. So very similar, but there's lots of nuance that I won't get into here because I'm sure I will confuse myself, but we tried to outline it in this fourth article. So those are our definitions, those are our examples, and I will shoot it back to Jeffra, I believe, so that we can move to the next thing.
And it is a Zoom call, so Jeffra, you're muted.
Thank you. That is true. Now I'm not, thankfully. Okay. It's classic. It is classic. It's been like 4 years and it's still like, so-and-so, you're muted. So yeah, so one of the things that we really wanted to do with this space was to invite you in. And so we gave you a little bit of background, gave you some examples, but we'd really like to engage with you. And so we have some questions for you to think about. That if you want to, you can unmute yourself, you can type in the chat, but maybe you've already read through some of the articles, or maybe this is some of your first time seeing it, but as Gr was mentioning, we're putting into this sort of permanence these definitions, but we also acknowledge that there's an evolution that happens, right, with these concepts. And we also found, I'm going to be honest, we didn't mention this, but we also found regionally, we also had different understandings of the concepts based on where things and how things were progressing in our particular locale of where we lived, or even community wise, right? So maybe you have that experience as well. And so, yeah, we would love to hear from you. We're curious about how your understandings might be different, or if something has already kind of percolated up to your mind of how these concepts, and again, could be the 4 that we talked about today, or any from any of the articles, relate most directly to your work as a science librarian. And we'd love, yeah, so we're just opening that space. And while you think a little bit about that, I will say that our College of Science has been doing more and more work related to, well, I guess what we've been calling on our campus. We've been calling it on our campus JEDI work, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, which I'm still like little whatever about it. I mean, I want the work to be done. Sometimes you have to release names and other times you have to fight that battle, but I'm not there yet. And so I've just joined on whenever they're doing that work. I show up and I ask questions and I share what I can where it's appropriate. And I think, that's always a little bit, because we're an outsider, but we're also a little bit of an insider. And it's a kind of a strange sort of balance in where you can impact things. But yeah, we'd love to hear if you have thoughts to share, questions to ask. You could also ask us questions.
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing. Yeah, if you don't want to share your thoughts, but you just want to ask us something, happy to respond to that.
Joyce says that their campus at Bryn Mawr College has also switched to JEDI, and it really throws them off when they hear that.
I mean, I think it's kind of fair, especially if you look at, say, the prequel trilogy. I wouldn't necessarily say those Old Republic Jedi were the best at justice. Not especially great, actually. They seem more like just a military arm of the Republic. So.
There's also a move to include accessibility in this. So throwing an A in there somewhere. Don't know where that would go.
We're doing more belonging work at Purdue. So some of our acronyms have changed and dropped some letters and added belonging. So
That's really interesting.
No, I think actually that shift to belonging is a great idea in a lot of ways, especially. I mean, I as my collaborators here know, I try to focus everything around math stuff, but belonging actually, like from the educational pedagogical research, belonging is the #1 indicator of mathematical achievement, is a sense of mathematical belonging. Like nothing is better, not money, not like parents, like nothing, but the sense of mathematical belonging, which of course is tied in with all of those, but it is sort of like a aggregate factor.
And that really brings it back to why we wanted to do these columns, right? Because there is the question of like, why are we spending all these years, all this energy to come to these understandings between us. And it really is, you know, these concepts are vital to creating a space where students can learn. You know, there are ways that the institutions are exclusionary, and the more you can, you know, kind of think about yourself as an actor within a social context, and not just you know, someone who is experiencing pure science or pure math, right? That experiencing yourself as an embodied person in a situation with other people who have different experiences is really important for students to learn, and also important for your colleagues and for the general atmosphere of your workplace.
Yeah, and I see Matthew's comment there too about in sponge mode, and I think that was something that, you know, I picked up in 2018, that there's like a high sense of interest, but it's like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know what to begin. And that's what I really wanted to see these articles as, is like that step that you can take into the space, that you can start being that sponge. You can start, and we have reflection questions at the end that you can start thinking about how to apply some of these things, and thinking of your sort of like first steps and third steps, step 10, you know, whatever. But that I think it's really important to start gaining that grounding of understanding the language that describes these issues, right? And processing that inside of the science world, in the library world, is so important to growing, to the growing process. And I think I had other thoughts, but they've already evaporated, because that's how they go.
You all really seem to have hit a chord with the Jedi. There's talks about the bad librarians in Star Wars, and that they had child soldiers. Sarah Weiss has shared a Scientific American article that says, maybe some people have seen this, but this article talks about some reasons why using Jedi is problematic. We had a patron bring this up recently. Rebecca Kim says some of the terms touch on the history of colonialism and racism in science and generally in culture. Has there been thought of telling this history of science more openly in the US and Europe, and its harm to, oh, sorry, I lost the thread. Things are coming quickly. I apologize. And its harm to people not part of the dominant culture, eugenics, crime control policies, etc. By the way, I also have an English and history background.
So I'm willing to jump in here if that's okay, y'all. So there is a move among some instructors within the sciences to include more of the unvarnished history of science in their classrooms while they're teaching things. I do know that oftentimes now, especially if there's younger instructors, stats classes do talk about the fact that statistics specifically comes from a eugenic background, that the things that we think of as the main areas of stats are literally have a backing in race science and science that was trying to show the dominance of white people. So there are examples of that, but it's not sort of like a cohesive movement, at least not from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, I don't know that we have plans to do anything. We have our special issue coming out, but I don't think we have plans beyond that. And I did one thing I did want to say, that was the other thought I had that I couldn't remember, was we didn't want these articles to just be a bibliography, right? We were very careful to we included links when they were very specifically relevant to something, but it was never meant to be like this long reading list of everything you can read about all these topics, right? It was more a narrative, sort of like understanding of concepts, I would say, with occasional references when appropriate. And so we didn't do a huge history lesson or anything. It was more of a present visualization of these concepts. And this time, note the date on this article. and the location of these authors and identities of these authors, this is the picture you get of these concepts. It's the narrative you get for these concepts. So, but yeah, I think that's a great question, Rebecca. Anyways, there could be something out there. I don't know, but I think like Sam, it's hopefully a work in progress somewhere.
And then Jody wants to know, and then I think even farther down, there's people commenting on this in regards to acronyms and different inclusion or exclusion of terms. Jody asks, how would you define belonging? And then Jody says, no pressure, I'm not as familiar with the concept.
Maybe Nastasha, since you said that's kind of a focus for your university.
Yeah, I put in a germane text for someone who really defined belonging theory. I'm not tooting my horn, but for those of you who know Megan Sam Nelson, she and I wrote a article about institutional data and belonging, specifically, if you want to look at it. So I'm going back through my literature review, librarian style, just to figure out ways that we defined it. And one of the ways is a sense of belonging is the experience of personal involvement in a system or environment so that a person feels themselves to be an integral part of that system, right? So not being outside of it, but being a part of it is one way that has been defined. Another way is refers to students' perceived social support on campus, a feeling of or sensation of connectedness, and the experience of mattering, feeling cared about, accepted, respected, valued, and important to the campus community or others on campus, such as faculty, staff, and peers. So that goes with Strayhorn in that particular work. He's one of the experts in belonging. So if you ever want to read up on it, you can just go to Google Scholar and type in Strayhorn and belonging, and lots of his work will come up.
And in presentations where I've talked about mathematical belonging, I have a much simpler, less academic definition, but essentially the idea of how well a person feels that they fit in a group or space versus something like identity, because you also can talk about mathematical identity, and that's the idea of a membership or affinity that's integral to a person's like sense of self. So one is much more internally focused, and then belonging is like that mixture of internal and the external.
And this is a really good example of how we do this, right? Because now I have some thoughts about belongingness from a slightly different perspective.
This is perfect.
This is great.
This
yeah.
is perfect. Yes.
Yeah. And just, just bringing in sort of the structural element, right? So looking at how the institution itself, right? There's this urge to kind of create add-ons, right? Like, oh, we need to bring in these folks, we need to bring in these folks, we need to bring in these folks, right? And then the structure is not changed. Whereas like if you're talking about true inclusion, right? True belonging, the structure has to be acknowledged. And the ways that the structure itself is oppressive and is actually exclusive by design. Right. And so I think the move toward belongingness, because we also are kind of engaging with that a little bit, is sort of a, acknowledging that like what makes someone feel like they belong somewhere is not just being present, but actually having influence, having the ability to change what's happening, right? Having some of the power involved in the situation.
Very true. I loved it. That's exactly what it was like when we had our meetings. Oh gosh, I feel like we should already be building a definition right now.
we were missing one thing, and Gr, I'm very upset that you did not include this. How can you tie hegemony into this definition? And for everyone who's paying attention,
what they said.
I
heard it.
That's hilarious. Yeah, Sam was always ribbing me because I tend to use the word hegemony a lot.
No, it was not just me. I believe Isabel actually started, but we all were there. Like we were trying to figure out a way to get us to define hegemony, but it never quite worked.
It never did.
It never worked into. No.
It was like
it's a running joke now. It's the one concept we didn't include, but we talked about a lot. So it's just a joke now.
So there's another question in the chat from Rebecca Jefferson that says, did any of you come across a conceptual framework that included non-linguistic forms of code switching? In one of the old institutions where I worked, BIPOC grad students used to use the phrase code switching to also cover changes they made to their appearance to conform with the dominant culture of medicine in this case. Is that a quote thing in the literature or anywhere else?
Hey team, I know we talked about code switching. Maybe somebody can bring up those old notes, but there are some frameworks and maybe one of us can contact you offline. But we did talk about the linguistic part of it because that was a part of the foundational, the foundations of the term, right? But then moving towards behavior. So yes, we did. And someone will look in our notes and see if there's something in particular that jumps out, but we did talk about it. I guarantee you.
And if I remember correctly, while we did focus primarily on linguistic, we do specifically say linguistic code switching. So we are talking about other behaviors and not just linguistic ones. Even in our definition, it's just a lot of times with our definitions, we will start with where they came from. And code switching did come from a linguistic background. But I know that at least I quite often talked about other types of code switching during our definition. I know that other people did as well. I did not have a framework for it, though. I just brought it up because I'm like, yeah, people dress differently in different situations. Like code switching is something that is it's everywhere and it's constant. But the thing is that when you have to switch to get yourself to be taken seriously, it's like by a dominant culture, because you are someone who has been excluded from those rooms most of the time, or you are excluded if you come as your natural self. Like that is a much harder mental and physical thing to have to do than if you are a part of a dominant culture and you decide to code switch to belong to a subordinate or a culture that has been subordinated. And so like that's why that is the focus of the definition most of the time. I think those thoughts made sense, but I have no idea at this point.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we discovered with our words and our language, and the part that we were learning ourselves, was we wanted to do a good job of covering this vocabulary, right? So to Sam's point, we had to uncover like the linguistic part. We had with some of our other words, we had to uncover like the historical nature of the word, right? What was the original intent of the word versus how the word is being used today? So we really had to like sift through some of those things in ways that it would mean the most to our community.
Yeah. Yeah, it was the two of you, by the way, that worked on this definition. So I did.
That's why it rings a bell with me.
Yeah, and of course it was. And also, Nastasha, original intent. Have you been reading Supreme Court decisions?
Actually, I have. Thank you.
I've lost track of chat, so someone
There,
will have to.
there are a lot of interesting links in the chat and comments on what people are saying, but I think for now that is all of the questions out of the chat. But if I have missed one, please. Oh wait, Jody just put a new one in. Jody says, are there any terms or definitions that you have since discovered or maybe even been created since your final publication that you wish you could have included?
Hegemony? No.
God, hegemony is becoming really hegemonic in this conversation.
Yeah.
So Jody, I do think belonging, which you just said, it's just honestly, I personally haven't thought that deeply about it. I kind of, if I can get away with not having to define any words for a bit, I'm okay with that. Like I love working with these people, and we are still working together. But this project, it really was a lot. Like it was incredibly fun. Well, fun. It was incredibly rewarding. It was fun at times, but like it's one of those things where like it's rewarding. You enjoyed it. You are proud of the result, and you don't want to do it again.
I think I can't remember. Is Gr, maybe you remember? Did we talk about co-opting? I remember us having conversations about it, but I don't know if it's anywhere in our language. Because I think when we first started this list, times have changed, right? And code words have changed even, right? So I think, but that was something that we were conscious of, like as we were writing. So it's hard to, it was a snapshot in time, if you will. But I think some language around, I guess the ways that EDI work, social justice work is co-opted. I think I probably would want to put something like that in there, and not in a good way, right? To be prepared for it, especially at some of our campuses. To Jeffra's point about the regional stuff, we have California. Isabel was at Georgia Tech when she started this project, who's still now in Auburn. I'm originally from North Carolina, but I live in Indiana, which is just like North Carolina. And so just like having to say like, and and Sam in Michigan, like we having to say, wait, Jeffra, we can't say that in Indiana, right? So right, and just think that through and what that looks like. But to all that point, like our cities and our nations and our universities have changed in some ways since we started this work. And I guess it would have been good to prep people for that in some way, or even prep ourselves, maybe prep myself. I don't know, prep myself for that shift in the language and what we do.
Yeah. We definitely, sorry, Sam.
Oh, I'm going to say just quickly, we did say at the end of the fourth column that we are more than happy for other people to continue on this work if you have words that you personally want to define.
Yeah, absolutely. Or revise, like there's that, like we've all said, they're evolving because these are so culturally built up and defined, and regional, just a lot of things. And so I hope this work will continue. I hope it gets revisited and critiqued. That's fine too. So I was thinking too, like one of the ones I also remember as being really challenging was ally, solidarity, accomplice. We spent a lot of time on that. That was also very nuanced. That one I think was one of the ones that was also very regionally. We all had very different experiences, lived experiences and ideas around this, and trying to, I felt like when we were building this one, it was like curving and moving and shifting, and we were trying to move around these different sort of ways to cover the different ways that people would recognize, identify with, understand, could use, find value in the definition. That one was quite a feat, as I think also as well as like decolonization. But something you were saying too reminded, we did try to, we were looking at things from I would say sort of a progressive lens, like identifying sort of some areas of, I don't even want to use the word negativity, but I can't think of the right now. That's kind of where my zone is. But trying to think of like, what is the progressive way we view this? Because we had some concepts that were defined. And we're like, no, that's looking backwards. And we want to be looking forwards. Like sometimes we had to define the thing, or we had to talk about it, it had to come up. But other times we're like, that's not where we're going to sit. We're going to move forward. We're going to look at this concept instead, because that's pushing us forward. So I do want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, especially the third column and the fourth column or article or whatever we call it these days. We really wanted to like shift us towards a place. And that's why we had that scaffolding. I mean, this was a very thoughtful project. So I appreciate Jeffra and the team for this, because we did some thoughtful work, right? In trying to build a better library.
Yeah.
Capital L.
Capital.
There's a comment in the chat it looks like the chat is fully chatting about it, but there's another comment that really speaks to how these terms evolve. It says, I really appreciate your capturing these concepts as a snapshot in time, and I wonder whether you've considered providing these in an editable format. And someone says that's a great idea, and Sam toward the end said they are CC licensed. So um, it looks like that's there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if people want to do it, please go ahead. I will warn you, if you put this on the open web and you allow people to openly edit social justice terminology, be careful what you wish for. It will not necessarily go badly, but there is always a chance for something like that to be found by these sorts of people who will use it for ill.
That said, though, I think that would be a really great group project. Like if there's a group of folks who are interested in kind of taking this and running with it, you know, like doing the next generation or the next variation on these terms or others. I mean, for me, I know that like there's a lot of terminology out there that and we had to make some decisions. Like it wasn't an infinite kind of a space, you know. And also I think a wiki would be really cool because it could kind of it would be a visual representation of like the web of these concepts, right? The way that they interact together, you know, because we have links, right, back and forth to the different terms. But
we tried.
Yeah. But then I think as you go forward, right, into the more complex ones, we also struggled with trying not to use terminology that we hadn't defined yet. Right. And so once we got to the end, we were kind of like, how do I say that without using the word hegemony? How does that work? So I love this idea, and I would be super stoked to see it happen.
Yeah.
That's a great segue. We were interested in ways that libraries have used this work. We heard murmurings about professional development, workshops, things like that, about people continuing this conversation. So the conversation doesn't necessarily have to be in Wiki, right? But is there any libraries represented who are using this work internally or externally? They want to self-identify? I don't know.
While we're waiting for that, I will say there are other open editing frameworks that could allow for like sidestepping like the open wiki editing issue, and I would be more than happy to consult on the implementation of some of those. I do know some of them pretty well. It's just I also enjoyed the idea. I didn't mean to like shoot it down or anything, but just to think very carefully about the editing process.
Yeah, I think this is open work, and it is ripe and ready for use. Like I encourage the next team, like jump on board.
Yeah, and also I think you know, we recognize, and I think I can speak for all of us, that you know, not only is it a snapshot in time, but it's also you know, who we are is not fully representative of anyone who might be impacted by you know, social justice terminology, Jedi terminology, any of the, you know, and we're not experts on these terms, and right. So our intent was to like engage deeply with these terms, coming from what we know, what we've read, what we've been able to find out, and fully intending to have that be open to like, right, you might have a different experience of this, you might have different expertise on this, there are people, you're right, and also these things change. So I just want to reiterate that like going forward, this absolutely should be taken up by many other people. Lots of
that's a point.
Lots of other people should be engaging with this. We're not trying to like, you know, it's not my precious, like we really want you to run with it. So, you know, yeah.
Oh, good. We've had Star Wars references, Lord of the Ring references. This is great.
And plus, we already have our precious published with the DOI, so like we have a permanent home for our thoughts on this.
Yeah.
So I am seeing from Janet in the chat that they were trying to gather a glossary of terms, but there were so many caveats, terms evolving, terms that were embraced by some, not by others, terms that mean one thing to an institution may mean something to another group, and others. So, and other such problems, and so that they ended up giving up. Janet, would you mind sharing a little bit more about the context of how, like, where, like, what group, like, what, in what way you were trying to gather this glossary? And this is, I will say, also part of the reason that I think we really wanted these definitions is because otherwise you end up with that problem where you're like, okay, so here's what we think about inclusion, and then you link to like 4 different definitions of inclusion that you find on the internet that don't agree with one another. And so, like, for us, at least part of the value add was you know, not of being able to just link to one thing.
Those in the call in chat, I've responded and said it was definitely a labor of love for us, right? So we get, you know, the ability to shift and want to quit and all the things. And we had job shifts. You know, one of us decided to go back to school. We had all types of life changes. COVID happened to us. It's like all these things. So, and you know, we kind of still committed to this work. We did commit to this work.
Yeah.
And so it does seem like Janet answered in the chat. They were trying to assess collections for inclusivity. Want a glossary, so librarians assessing all had the same definition to assess various collections. Okay, yes, I can definitely see how it would be hard to get people to agree to what definitions mean in that specific area, because yeah, the humanities means something different than the sciences, which means something different than the social sciences, and everyone else. Yeah. Ginny also adds, this work is extremely important for more folks to undertake, considering the awful anti-DEI bills that several states are trying to pass, and in some cases have passed. I will editorialize at the end of Ginny's comment.
You know, and
I didn't, go ahead, girl, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Jeffra. I just was going to say that, you know, I definitely understand how that may feel, like the project of trying to develop a glossary and then not really getting there can kind of feel like a failure or something, but I actually view that differently. I think that the work of grappling with terms and attempting to come to an understanding together is vital, and that all libraries should do that. I know that actually we also are trying to kind of figure out like our collections approach, our philosophy to collections with this, with a lens of like, right, are we just trying to do representational, but what does that mean? What is the impact of that, right? Like, what do our students actually need? I mean, it gets into all sorts of questions about, you know, knowledge production, where do ideas come from, you know, who funds studies, who, you know, like, who are these publishers, like what's their political, you know, perspective, right? There's lots of questions that even if you don't come to some kind of conclusion, right? Even if it's not like written in stone, which it never will be, it's still valuable. And I think we have to do that all the time. I think that even if we, and actually, especially if you're not coming to some kind of conclusion, right? Because that is the work. That's what has to be done. We have to grapple with those things. We have to think about them.
And right, like in dictionaries, words have multiple definitions, and that's actually okay. Like there can be more than one definition for these words. And it's just, you have to be willing to understand that other people's definitions might be as legitimate as your own, and then to come to a shared understanding about what you mean by it together. As Gr was just saying, like, that is very important. I think that's a lot of the work we ended up doing as a group.
And the places where you disagree are places where maybe you want to have some kind of like reading group, or you all want to go out and do some like, which is what we did, right? we come to a point where we just inherently disagree, and then we had to go out and be like, okay, well, why am I so attached to this? Like, where did I get this from? Or what about me? What about my life is making me so sure that this is how it is, right? Am I just being kind of stuck on like a like a semantic quirk, right? Or is it something that's actually content that really is meaningful to me? And the process of like mushing all that up together and coming to an agreement that we all could stand by, right? Because for us, we were putting our names on this. We were going to put this out in the world and say, yes, we agreed on all of this. And so it was very important for us to agree. Like we couldn't just be like, well, I disagree with that, but whatever, you can publish it. Like, no, that's not going to work, right? Especially with something that's this can be, so it can be so, it's so important, and it can be so sort of, you know, it's like hot button issues or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I am so sorry to step in here, but
I see Jody's face has appeared.
It's been an amazing conversation, and I do really, really appreciate the amazing questions and the conversation. It's just been wonderful. But we are at time, and I do want to be mindful of your time. So thank you so very much to all of you for being here and for contributing to this amazing discussion. I really appreciate it. To everybody here, please join us again at 3. After I take care of this giant spider who's like down my wall right now. And we will be back for Dr. Lidia Ponce de la Vega's presentation. Same Zoom link. So once again, thank you very much to everybody, and we'll talk to you very soon.
Thank you all.
Go ahead and get started. Thank you very much, and welcome to the STS Annual Program for 2023. We are very happy to present today Dr. Lidia Ponce de la Vega, who will be speaking on the decoloniality of biodiversity collections, Latin America, and the Biodiversity Heritage Library. Before we get started, we just want to thank very, very much to IEEE for their very generous sponsorship of our 2023 STS Conference Program. Thanks to their generosity, we are providing live captioning today for our event. And so again, thank you very much to IEEE. Some general announcements before we get started. Please keep the conversation respectful. We do follow the ACRL's Code of Conduct, as well as the ALA's Virtual Meeting Code of Conduct. If someone could throw the links to those in the chat, that would be super helpful. Oops, this is not the correct information here. We do have a code of conduct point person. It is not me, but you can feel free to reach out to me personally if you feel that someone has gone over the line on one of the codes of conduct. But our point person is also going to be Julia Gelfand. So I apologize for that. This meeting is going to be recorded, and the video will be posted to our new STS YouTube channel and on the STS LibGuide for future viewing. Just as a general practice, please keep yourself muted and your camera off unless you would like to speak or ask a question. Dr. Ponce de la Vega is very happy to address questions as they occur. You can also put questions into chat. We have several chat monitors who will be keeping track of those questions to make sure that those are addressed. Okay. A few more special thanks, first of all, to all of our presenters today, but especially right now to Dr. Ponce de la Vega for very generously giving her time to speak with us today. To all of our volunteers, thank you to SignNexus for helping with our live captioning, and an extra special thank you to Kayla, who is our captioner for today. And of course, thank you to our viewers for attending. Finally, we'd like to thank the Conference Program Planning Committee. All of the members are listed there. Everyone has done such a wonderful job of planning this event all year. And an extra special thanks and shout out to my co-chair, Jody Coulter, who's been amazing this year. So today's agenda, we did have 2 pieces. If you were at our earlier presentation, I hope you enjoyed our panel discussion. But as I said, today we are very thankful to have with us our speaker, Dr. Lidia Ponce de la Vega. And I'm just going to do a brief introduction for her before she gets started. So Dr. Ponce de la Vega's research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of Latin American studies, eco-criticism, and digital humanities, especially regarding the epistemic decolonization of Latin American nature and biodiversity in digital archives. She has collaborated with the Biodiversity Heritage Library, performing data collection analyses to identify gaps and biases in BHL's catalog. Lidia is currently working on a research project around the decolonization of online knowledge about non-human species that Latin American countries consider their national symbols. With a focus on materials available through the Biodiversity Heritage Library, Lidia is collecting species to contrast the national value boundaries. Her project thus constitutes a decolonial critique of digital and non-digital epistemic and archival constructions of biodiversity and nation. So I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I will turn it over to Dr. Ponce de la Vega.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. So hopefully you can all see my presentation. And okay, so I'll get started. And first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and also everyone at STS for inviting me, for having me here today. Rebecca, Jody, Lauren, and everyone who helped organize this and who so generously invited me to share some of the work that I'm doing. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow. The full title is Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow for the Diversification of the Environmental Humanities. So a lot of the topics that I'm going to be discussing today have a lot to do with topics of decolonization and diversification. And I would also like to acknowledge that I'm currently located in Williamsburg. I'm in the College of William and Mary that is located in the traditional unceded lands of the Nottoway, the Chickahominy, the Mataponi, the Monacan, the Nansemond, the Pamunkey, the Patawomeck, and Rappahannock tribes, which are colonially occupied by the state of Virginia. So my presentation today, I have titled The Decoloniality of Biodiversity Collections, Latin America and the Biodiversity Heritage Library, or BHL. So it's really a critical approach with a decolonial lenses over the case of the Biodiversity Heritage Library, the collections that they make available through their platform, and also both the colonial biases that they continue to transmit, but also the decolonial opportunities that this library and other libraries and other efforts and projects have to really address a lot of the issues that I'm going to be highlighting today. And also wanted to mention that some of the examples that I'm going to be showing today come from my work with BHL during an internship under Program Director Martin Kalfatovic. So I'm also indebted to them. And it's also, I have to say, been a really enriching experience to work directly with them, to really share some of the practices that I am suggesting and the strategies that I am suggesting, which have been taken into account. So that's always something to be thankful for. All right, so before I really delve into it, I would like to introduce to you the Biodiversity Heritage Library in case you haven't heard of it or are not super familiar with it. This is a screenshot of their home. And as you can see here, sorry, I'm getting a message from Zoom. Are we still on, or can you still see me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay, perfect. I was getting an error message from Zoom, so I wasn't sure if everything was still working. But anyway, so I wanted to introduce BHL to begin this presentation. And okay, now I
think we lost you for half a minute.
Yes, now it happened. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on. There, so hopefully you can see my presentation again, and I hope that doesn't happen again. I'm really sorry. I don't know what was going on. Okay, so this is BHL, and if you can see here on the homepage, this image from their homepage, they have this description that says inspiring discovery through free access to biodiversity knowledge. The Biodiversity Heritage Library improves research methodology by collaboratively making the biodiversity literature openly available to the world as part of a global biodiversity community. So there are a lot of words here that really are very valuable and show the important mission that BHL is undertaking, but that also highlight a lot of the problems that can come with this sort of project. For instance, talking about collaboratively making biodiversity literature available, that collaboration, really, how is that happening? Who is engaging in this collaboration and who is not? And then free access or open access is another one of those questions, right? Open for whom? To what extent is open access really open? And perhaps one of the things that most interest me in my research, this idea of the world and a global biodiversity community. And what exactly does it mean to talk about the world and to talk about global communities, right? So that is really what a lot of what I'm going to be showing you today focuses on. But before I get to actually the nuances of BHL and the biases and the colonial processes that I analyze, I would like to share with you this text. So I'm moving a little bit away from BHL, but I promise it will make sense. So this is a text that is called De Libellus de Medicinalibus Indorum Herbis. It's in Latin. It translates into English roughly as the little book of medicinal herbs from the Indies. And this is a text by Martín de la Cruz that was translated to Latin by Juan Badiano. And this text comes to us from 1552. It comes from colonial times from what we now call Mexico. And it is a compendium of Mexican medicinal plants. Now, it is a very important text for many reasons, some of which I'm going to be sharing with you today. Maybe the most evident one is that it is the first documented herbal in the Americas. So this is really a very important historical position that this text holds in terms of the history of botany, in terms of natural history, and also knowledge production in the Americas. But then it's also a text that was produced originally in Nahuatl by Indigenous author, Dr. Martín de la Cruz, and translator Juan Badiano. They were both Indigenous scholars working at the Colegio de la Santa Cruz, which was an institution that was originally established to, quote unquote, educate Indigenous peoples in this colonial system that was established in what we now call Mexico. But that eventually became really a place of a lot of exchange. So Indigenous scholars really had a lot of opportunities. Of course, not the colonial nature of the institution notwithstanding, they still had a lot of opportunities for knowledge production and knowledge exchange. And this is the product of that exchange and that work. And I'm also using the word produced because this text, it's not known whether there was a written version in Nahuatl or if it was dictated in Nahuatl by Martín de la Cruz and then written directly into Latin by Juan Badiano. There's no version, no written version of it in Nahuatl. But in the end, what really matters is that we see this kind of milestone in the history of botany happening in the Americas, but that is also a key example of Indigenous knowledge production during this time. And as such, it includes bilingual and bicultural elements that are also very interesting from the point of view of natural history and also of art and history in general. So I'm showing you here one of the pages of this text, and it really represents how this text is structured. We have at the top the plant name in Nahuatl. So plant names are actually not translated. They are kept in Nahuatl throughout the text, which means that this text also represents a Nahuatl taxonomy of plants. Then we have a plant illustration that was created by Indigenous artists in a very traditional Indigenous style for this period. Then we have a disease name in Latin, usually the disease that this plant is used for, and the translated text in Latin. So with these elements, with the history of this text, we can see that this is an example of cross-cultural colonial and decolonial, both at the same time, knowledge production. So the reason why I'm showing you this, it's because the libellus is not part of BHL. So then the question really is, why is a text of so much value from so many different perspectives, a text so valuable for science, for history, for art, for many disciplines, and from many perspectives, why is it not part of BHL? And of course, I'm not arguing that BHL should have absolutely everything there is about biodiversity out there, because of course that's not possible. But I do see the absence of the libellus as symptomatic of broader processes that are happening at the basis of our structures of knowledge production and knowledge collection and the building of libraries in general. So I'm using this as a sort of excuse to really delve into those kind of questions. Not only what is missing, but why is it missing? And so to start exploring these issues, I would like to start with the idea that archives in general, digital archives in this case, act as storytelling mechanisms, right? And because they are storytelling mechanisms or storytelling machines, it's important to ask, whose stories are these archives telling? And perhaps most importantly, whose stories are they not telling? And tied to that then, by whom are these stories being told? For whom and through what means? And all of this thinking about who then can and cannot be a storyteller. And in the specific case of BHL, considering that the library is called Biodiversity Heritage Library, then we need to ask, whose biodiversity are we talking about? And very importantly, whose heritage? And this, of course, entails a lot of questions, ethical and political and geopolitical questions that come with the idea of heritage as well. And in the end, really, the big picture, the big question to ask is, whose archive? And coming back to that description of BHL on their homepage, is this really global? Is this really openly accessible to the world? Those are really the questions that, that fuel a lot of the analysis that I'm going to be presenting to you. And all of this with the objective of contributing to the decolonization of biodiverse histories, focusing on the revalorization of Latin America, the Global South, and Indigenous communities and subjects and sites of biodiverse knowledge production. And specifically for this presentation, hopefully I can give you some examples and some ideas of practices and reflections that you can apply to your own collections and to your own libraries. And to show you a little bit of what this can look like specifically in the case of certain materials and collections, I'm going to give you 4 examples. I hope I will have time to give you all 4. I think I will, but we'll see. But these are all examples that relate to the representation of Latin America in the library, in the library's collections and through the library's materials. So I have one example that has to do with non-human species, another that revolves around languages and language representation, one that has to do with nation representation, and finally, a case of repatriation. So let's start with the example about non-human species. And this beautiful plant, Bertholletia excelsa, it's a scientific name. You might know it as Brazil knot, it has many names. And I'm showing you here an illustration from the Annals of Botany from the early 20th century. And this is a very interesting species. It has a very, very long history that goes hand in hand with a lot of colonial histories, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. It's a plant that is endemic to the Orinoco River region, especially grows in Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. So one of the main reasons that I'm showing you the case of Bertholletia excelsa here, it's because it has a very rich history, and it has a very rich history, especially that intertwines with the history of the British Empire. So that's really what we're going to be looking at right now. So this history of Bertholletia excelsa doesn't start directly with the British Empire. It actually starts earlier. It starts in the 17th, 18th century with the Dutch, who already valued this plant when they found it in in the Orinoco River area, and they started exporting it to Europe. So this actually was already a valuable plant when the British started to pay attention to it, which really happened starting around 1799, sorry, and 1804, with Bonpland and Humboldt's expedition to Central and South America. And this is the moment when Berthollet excelsa receives that name. This is the moment that they name it, and it finds its way into European Western taxonomic systems. And this is really when the European interest in this plant starts to grow. And even more so in the second half of the 19th century, especially after 1866, when Brazilian ports are open for free trade. And this is really the key moment when the British Empire really sees this as a big opportunity to start exportation plants, which were not only for Berthollet excelsa, they were for a lot of species and products that were coming from South America. But then after this, with this exportation plans, there really comes this boom of exportation of Berthollet excelsa that leads also to this species being introduced, imported, exported also throughout the British Empire, so into other British colonies. In 1881, it starts being exported by the Botanical Department of Jamaica. And by the end, closer to the end of the 19th century, it's really found its way in British colonies, especially after 1887 with its introduction to Queensland and Singapore. Now, I'm showing you this and I'm giving you this history of Berthollet excelsa and the British Empire because a lot of this we can actually see mirrored in the materials that BHL has in its collections. So when we look at the metadata of records on BHL, we can actually see a lot of this history is reflected in these materials. So what I did was extract materials from BHL that include the scientific name Berthollet excelsa. And I'm not going to stop too much on methodologies, but if anyone is interested, now we're at the end, I'm really happy to discuss them. But just to say that what I did was to extract all materials that mention or contain the scientific name Berthollet excelsa and found 680 materials. This is still a very small sample, considering that BHL, I think last time I checked, it was at over 180,000 titles. So this is a small sample, but what we can say about these materials is that these are the materials in the library that talk about Berthollet excelsa. So these are the materials that are really producing and disseminating knowledge about these species. Now, once I had the records of all of those materials, I started to look for patterns of publication, patterns of language, and so on. And so here I am showing you a density map, and I hope you can all see it well, and I hope nobody has problems with the colors. If not, you might be able to see places where it's darker. So the darker the color or the dots are, the larger the concentration of materials being published in those places is. And what we see here, and it's very easily perceptible, is that places of publication are largely dominated by Europe and the US. And amongst this, it's especially in London, New York, and Paris. So these three cities together account for almost 40% of the publications about Berthollet excelsa. And London is at the top with almost 24%. So almost a quarter of these materials are coming from London. But I'm going to leave that for 2 seconds and also highlight, actually, despite that presence of Europe and the US, we do see the importance of the Global South as places of publication. So if you pay attention to places throughout the Global South, and especially in what we call Latin America, you see that there's several dots there, and some with actually significant concentration. So when we look at these places of publication, especially those in Latin America, we see this list. Now, of course, if you look at the number of titles, most of them just have one title published there. So it's still not a dominating knowledge production or publication that's coming from there. But what's especially interesting are the first 4 cities listed here, which are also the ones that have more than one title published there, which are Rio de Janeiro, Pará, Belém, and Sao Paulo, and all of them are in Brazil. And what's even more interesting about these ones is that all of these publications that are coming from these 4 Brazilian cities were also published after 1824, which is the year of the independence of Brazil from Portugal. And that's also key because it allows us to think about the roots of these materials and thinking about how we could actually consider Brazil as a post-colonial place of publication of knowledge about Bertolete Excelsa, even though it still makes under 3% of these materials. Now let's go back to the map. And now that we're on the map, we can look at other dots in other places outside of the US and Europe, and also outside of Latin America. And you see that there are some very interesting places, especially in Africa and Asia. And one could think, looking at this, that these are materials that are coming from places throughout the global South and that show a bit of a diversification of publications about Bertolete Excelsa. Unfortunately, when we look at the actual details of these places of publication, a lot of them, if not most of them, were British colonies at the time of publications of these materials. So here I have the list. These are all the cities that have the total of their knowledge production, the total of the materials coming from these places are coming from times when these places were British colonies. And then if we also correlate that with the language of publication of these materials, and we see this clear dominance of the English language, over 60% as the language of knowledge production about Bertolete Excelsa, we really see that there is a strong Anglocentrism and a strong relationship between the British Empire and the knowledge production about Bertolete Excelsa. So what we're seeing here in general is that the travel stories of the Brazil knot, as told by BHL, are in reality the colonial histories of Europe as the producer of knowledge and the global South as the object of study and subject to coloniality. And in the case of Bertolete Excelsa, it also is very important to reflect on these histories because Bertolete Excelsa also has a very strong relationship with several histories from indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples in the Amazonian area, in the Orinoco River area, have had and continue to have really very strong influence on the extraction, distribution, and reproduction of these species. Meaning that this heavy Eurocentrism, Anglocentrism, global North-centrism of the collections in BHL are showing the denied shared stories of the human and non-human other, and how they are excluded from archival representation, and the contributions of indigenous peoples are obscured. So this is why it's important to look at those details, at those gaps in the knowledge production. And since we are already in the topic of indigenous knowledges, this ties into my second example today, which has to do with languages and specifically indigenous languages. So let me start with my first subset. So now we're moving into a different set of materials. And these are materials that include one of these subjects. So, you know, you have title, author, place of publication, year of publication, and so on. And in most places, you will find also a subject list. Right? So what I did here is extract materials from BHL that include at least one of these subjects in their subject lists. Indians of Central America, of Mexico, of South America, or of the West Indies. Once I had the full records of those materials, I extracted the subject lists. Again, if anyone is interested in the details of the methodology, I'm happy to discuss them. But for now, what I did was really just take all of those subject lists together and analyze their patterns to see not only where these subjects are appearing, but also what are other subjects that are appearing together with these ones. And to do that, I built this co-occurrence network. So what a co-occurrence network does is it shows the proximity of certain terms in a set of documents, in this case, in that list of subject lists. And the bigger the circle you see on this graph, the more frequent that word is, the closer they are to each other, the more likely they are to appear together in this subject lists. So if you look at the biggest, the most intricate graph here, which is graph 01 in this kind of turquoise color, you see the terms that are actually part of the subset. You can see South America, you can see the word Indians, you can see Mexico, and you can see others that are very interesting, such as description and travel, natural history, and discovery and exploration, which are really pointing to colonial processes and to the colonial nature of a lot of these materials. But if we leave that for 2 seconds and focus on this other graph that's at the bottom, subgraph number 8 in kind of pink, and you look at the words that are popping up there, we see the words language, linguistics, vocabulary, and glossary, meaning that there's actually a very important presence of language-related terms and subjects in this subset. And then if we look at the context of the actual subject lists where these words are appearing, we see this. So this is a sample of some of these subject lists, and especially looking at the word language. And if you look at this list, you can see that the word language often appears accompanied by an adjective that refers actually to an indigenous language. So we have Maya language, Nahuatl language, Carib, Mapuche, Tupi, Kuna, etc. And these are all indigenous languages. Now, this is in subject lists, but what happens with the actual languages of these materials? Well, almost half of them are written in English, with other European languages being important as well, French and Spanish above average, German, Latin, French, Italian, Dutch and Portuguese also having an important presence. But then what are we seeing here? This is a clear example of that dichotomy, again, between the object of study and the knowledge production. So indigenous languages are objects of study, while European languages are the ones engaging in the actual production of the knowledge. And then you can tell me, well, that's probably because you picked these subjects, especially Indians of the West Indies. It's very unlikely to find West Indies anymore. That's a very colonial term. It has a very strong colonial history. And you're probably right. So to kind of see if that was also present in a different kind of subset, I built subset number 2 that I'm presenting to you here, which is based on indigenous specificity. These are subjects that refer to a specific indigenous group and that are contained in materials in the HL. So you have Carib Indians, Choco Indians, Kuna Indians, Yakira, Wajiro, Huichol, Kikapu, Mapuche, Maya, Mayoruna, Mojo, Chipibo, Conibo, Taino, Tairona, Tarahumara, and Yagan Indians. Same process, I extracted materials that contain at least one of these subjects in the subject list and built a co-occurrence network. Now, again, if I can draw your attention to subgraph 1 to the left in turquoise color, you see, again, the words that appear very often in the subset. Indians, of course, is the most frequent word. And we see some topics that were also in subset 1, description, travel, natural history, and so on. But then we also see the terms that were in that second graph in subset 1, glossary, vocabulary, linguistics, and language. So what we're seeing here is even a stronger relationship between the terms that refer to colonial texts and those that refer to languages. And then if we look at the actual languages and places of publication of this subset, we see this overwhelming dominance of the US and Europe. And I've worked with a lot of subsets based on languages, nations, species, and so on. And this is the only subset when this has happened, that there are no places of publication outside of the US and Europe, and also one of the most largely dominated by English, with almost 60% of these materials in English, French also making a very strong presence there, at almost 28%, and another interesting fact, this is one of the few subsets working with Latin America that does not include materials in Spanish whatsoever, which is also, of course, there's a big problem of Spanish privilege in what we call Latin America, but even so, the presence of Spanish is also important for Indigenous communities because a lot of them have either lost their Indigenous language and speak only Spanish, or I'm of course referring to the region we call Latin America, or are bilingual and speak both their Indigenous language and Spanish. So we really see here even a more striking dichotomy between Indigenous languages as objects of study and Indigenous peoples as objects of study, and European languages as engaging in the knowledge production. But not only that, so to add on top of that, there is a very interesting relationship between Indigenous and non-human representation. So what I'm showing you here are the 30 most frequent terms in the subject lists in the two subsets I just presented to you. Subset 1 is to the left, subset 2 is to the right. And I'm going to give you 2 seconds to maybe look through these words a little bit. Again, Indians, of course, is a very frequent word given the subjects that I selected, but you can also see other words. Natural history is there a lot, description, travel, discovery, exploration, account, imprint, geology, archaeology, language, linguistics, and so on. Now, thinking back to the fact that these subsets are coming from the Biodiversity Heritage Library, what is happening here and what is not there? I'll give you the answer. There are no biodiversity related terms in this list. So what we're seeing here is that in BHL's materials concerning the Indigenous peoples of what we call Latin America, the focus of attention is not necessarily biodiversity, but Indigenous peoples themselves, who to a certain extent, quote unquote, substitute non-human species as objects of study. So this is how we see that the coloniality of both humans and non-humans, the colonial processes that make both human and non-human victims, is really perpetuated in the materials that are being collected and disseminated through BHL. And this is not the case only for Indigenous peoples. It actually extends to other dimensions. In the case of Latin America, to nations specifically. And to show you that, I'm going to show you the example of Panama. I'm just going to look at the time because I do want to give enough time for questions at the end. I think I'm good for the final 2 examples. So I'm going to show you now the case of Panama to think about now in that realm of nation and national representation. So for us to really understand what's going on with the representation of Panama in VHL, I would like to give you a little bit of historical context about the Panama Canal. And maybe some of you are familiar with it, but in case you're not, just a very, very quick history of the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal actually began as a French project in the late 19th century, but it was later taken over by the United States that initiated the construction of the canal in 1904 and concluded the project in 1914. And this concession of the region of the Panama Canal was a result of US participation in the separatist movement in Colombia. And then that's what led to US control of the region, which continued until 1979, when it was transferred to the Panama Canal Commission, which was a joint agency of the US and Panama. And the canal remained under control of this joint agency until 1999, when the canal's administration was left exclusively in the hands of Panama. Now, that was a very, very quick overview, but again, there's a reason why I'm telling you this quick history of the Panama Canal. And it is because perhaps even more than in the previous cases I've been showing you, it transfers almost exactly into the collections of BHL. So this, again, these are places of publication of materials in the library that include the subject Panama. Now, if you look at the second to last row, so right above Washington, DC, I'm calling this US expedition. Let me tell you why. When I was looking at these materials, I noticed that there was a very large number of materials that did not include a place of publication. It was simply empty. So when I went to look at those materials and why the place of publication was empty, I noticed that these are all field notes, which is why they don't include a place of publication, and because they are not publications. But in revising all of those materials, all of them, all 76 materials, and we're talking about 185 materials about Panama. So almost half, getting close to half of those materials were field notes that were affiliated with either the US government or a US research institution. And that is why I labeled them US expedition. And this is an example of how sometimes certain metadata standards can conceal this information and can conceal these colonial biases behind a lot of these materials. In leaving that place of publication empty, it might look like there's no problem there. But when we look at this, and these field notes, whether they're publications or not, are participating in the representation and knowledge production around Panama that BHL is undertaking. So we see this very strong presence and this US expeditions as the main source of knowledge from about Panama in BHL. But not only that, if we cross-reference that with the years of publications of the materials, again, here is the materials, the field notes that are affiliated with US expeditions, and then we look at the time frame, you can see it begins in 1903, more or less. That concentration that you see at the bottom, it begins around 1905 maybe, and then it ends closer to the 1980s, and then we see this larger concentration of publications in other places, especially in the US, going on till 1996. And if you remember the history that I just gave you, it coincides almost exactly with the time of the building of the canal between 1904 and 1914, and then US control of the canal, both unique and shared up until 1999. So what we're seeing here, once more, is that biodiversity-related epistemologies about Panama in the library are greatly subsumed to US history, politics, and economic interests. And therefore, the histories of the biodiversity of Panama that BHL tells are not those of Panama per se, but those of Panama through the neo-imperial epistemic lenses of the United States. Which again, we go back to those questions, right? Then is this the world? Is this global? And this even more so considering that only 3.78% of records about Panama are in languages other than English. And let's remember that the official language and the most spoken language in Panama is Spanish. So to end this reflection, especially around nations, I turn to this last example, which I promise will be brief enough to leave time for questions, that has to do with repatriation. And this is the case of another text that is called the Biologia Central Americana. Now, the big question to ask is BHL engaging in repatriation? Well, Constance Rinaldo, founding secretary, and Martin Pelfatovic, program director of BHL, have said before that BHL is repatriating scientific knowledge to all parts of the globe. And in a separate text, in a different instance, Constance Rinaldo actually gives the example of the Biologia Central Americana. And she says that it is being repatriated, that there are very few copies in the world. And by making it accessible online through BHL, it's finding its way back to the places of origin, especially Mexico and Central America. So the Biologia Central Americana is a natural history compendium of Mexico and Central America. It was directed, produced, edited by British naturalists Frederick Duquesne Godman and Osbert Salvin, based on their expeditions to Central America between 1857 and 1875, and then Godman's expedition to Mexico After Salvin passed, he was the one to finish the project, and he traveled to Mexico between 1887 and 1888. And then the multiple volumes of the Biologia, it's a massive work, were published between 1879 and 1915, not only by Gottman and Salvin, but also having a lot of other European authors engaging in the production of those volumes. Now, to talk about a little bit about the Biologia, I would like to highlight the Indigenous presence in the Biologia. So this is a quote that's coming from Gottman's introductory volume to the Biologia, and it says, I'm going to read the quote. In addition to the material obtained during our various visits to Central America, and that sent us by the natives we have trained, we found it necessary, for the sake of comparison, to acquire a more thorough knowledge of the South American fauna, and with that view employed various expert collectors whose names are recorded in the body of the work, to visit special localities in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Guyana, and other places in South America. So if you look at the bolded parts that I have in this quote, we see this very clear dichotomy that Gottman is making in the text between Indigenous peoples who were quote unquote trained and then used as labor and tool for that knowledge production. And then on the other side, these quote unquote expert collectors that are the ones that are, according to Gottman, engaging in the knowledge production and then being given credit in the actual publication. And this happens too in the metadata of BHL. We see here again another instance in which Indigenous peoples are recorded as subjects of study. You have down there the subject list. You can see Indians of Central America, Indians of Mexico, Mayas, and so on. And I don't have it here, but if you look at the list of authors, of course, all of these authors are listed, the same ones that Gottman is referring to. So what we're seeing here is a case of anonymous Indigenous labor at the basis of knowledge production, of colonial knowledge production. And so I leave the question there, can we talk about repatriation? So when we're working with this kind of texts, it's really important to be careful about those terms. Can we really think about this text as being repatriated by open access? So that's really to reflect and to remember that providing access is not akin to decolonization, just as digitizing is not akin to retribution or reparation. So to close my presentation, thinking about these 4 examples that I have given you today, I would like to close with this kind of set of possible practices and goals that can be, and that are for BHL in this case in particular, but that really can be extended to different libraries and different projects and collections. So for BHL and other libraries, to achieve true decolonization, it or they must advocate for equitable intra and interspecies relationships, meaning both human and non-human groups, by expanding multilingual interfaces and collections, especially focusing on languages that are already marginalized or absent, diversifying global partnerships and collections, especially outside institutional boundaries, so that there can be active community participation from marginalized groups, establishing decolonial and contextualizing parameters for metadata. I think giving context, especially finding those gaps, such as the places of publication in Panama, that have a very important impact on how that knowledge production is being presented. And focusing on the equitable inclusion of Indigenous and other knowledges and languages, all with particular attention to the Global South as a site of biodiversity-related knowledge production. And all of these are really, in the end, EDI goals with the idea of having a critical approach to collection, annotation, and dissemination practices. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions and talk about anything else or comments or whatever. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ponce de la Vega. It was so interesting. If anyone has questions, they can go ahead and type them in the chat. And while people are kind of still mulling that over and thinking, I have a question about, so as librarians, and most of us here are librarians, a number of us have responsibilities in collection development. So we are the ones who are selecting more materials to add to our collections. What would you suggest? Is there anything that we can do to help with this sort of dearth of resources published in the Global South? You know, we can only do so much individually, but as an organization, certainly we could probably push for more. So do you have any suggestions for us for our collecting areas?
Right. Yeah. So that's really a very good question, and it's often a question that I get. Where do we start, right? Because sometimes it seems so overwhelming, and there's so much that needs to be done. And I'm also aware of the limitations that many libraries and other similar archival projects have to face as well. So there are a lot of challenges, but I think identifying certain gaps should not be that hard. So looking at a language representation, for example, I'm sure you can go look in your materials, you know, and see where are we lacking language representation, and also based on your audiences, the audiences that you want to reach out to. So what are their characteristics? What are their needs? And there are certain gaps and certain specific absences that could be addressed without too much of a difficulty, but at first by identifying where they are, and then thinking about the kind of materials that could help overcome those. And in terms of the Global South, well, in the case of VHL, for example, partnerships are a big part of it. So really reaching out to institutions outside maybe of what's already your network, you know, trying to find other institutions, other communities that are working outside of the network that you have already built. So that will help increase that diversity. And really, I think it's a lot about intentionality. So intentionally going after that kind of partnership, intentionally reaching out to non-Anglophone institutions, which has, of course, its challenges in itself, right? But that is part of the work, and that is what I would suggest, just trying to identify the most immediate gaps, especially thinking about the public that you want to reach out to, and then trying to establish partnerships outside of the network that you already have. And I hope that helps answer that question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So I see Rachel has her hand up.
Thank you so much for that. You have several comments in the chat that say amazing work, wonderful presentation. And then one from Jody that says, this isn't really a question, but your presentation has my mind going in so many areas. I'm really struck by the biologia and the current movement to decolonize knowledge production in the sciences by people like John Annie and Paige West, and your push to expand multilingual interfaces and collections. Many of our collection development policies state explicitly we only collect English, which is a real problem if our researchers are producing multilingual research.
Yeah, so thank you, Rachel and Jody for your comment. Yeah, no, I mean, that is also part of the issues that we're seeing here, right? Because behind these collections, there's often in itself a system that's often colonial in itself, and it's carrying a lot of those colonial legacies. So, for example, this mandatory focus on English that, of course, becomes an obstacle and a challenge, especially when we're thinking about diversifying our collections, right? So in that case, for example, it's tricky, right? Like how do you find a way around that kind of policy without necessarily going against the policy? Because in the end, a lot of you and a lot of us are also employees, right? So there's also this kind of power dynamic because we are often not in the place to change the policy. But sometimes we can start pushing a bit for a change in the policy. Sometimes we can find ways to push, for example, increasing the presence of translations, you know, and I've always, whenever I talk to librarians or people working with archives, I always tell you your best friend is the notes category, the notes section. That's where you have the freedom to say a lot of things about the materials that you're collecting. So if you're, for example, choosing a translation of a material that's originally in a different language and it was translated into English, you can point there to that and even mention why you only hold the translation, right? And talk about the original language of this material is that, and the author is situated here, and we are including this because our collection is English only. And that in itself is a political statement. That in itself is a decolonial move that you can actually take to start addressing some of these issues. And eventually when, I don't know, 10, 20, 30% of your materials have that note, maybe that will initiate the change in policy. So those are the kind of steps, the kind of places where we can find these opportunities for political moves and decolonial moves.
Thank you. And I have a question, and that is just, I was wondering as I was hearing you talk, how this biodiversity library historically got its materials. And then I think a lot of us find ourselves in the situation, which I'm sure they do now, of trying to make up for past practices and trying to fill in the holes. And just, I was wondering, have you seen them try any of those things? I know you had all those amazing suggestions. Have you seen any attempts to correct historical gaps and holes?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. And yeah, so just to give you a little bit of context, BHL actually begins as a Smithsonian project in collaboration with some institutions in the UK. So it starts with those origins. And of course, a lot of my critique comes with the jump between those very limited origins to becoming global, right? So a lot of this is also a reflection around at what point can you ethically call yourself global, right? So, but what they tried to do in that trying to become global was once the project was kind of started, they began establishing these partnerships and this partnership schema to diversify their collection. So they established partnerships with institutions around the world. There are actually specific collections that are coming with from certain partners. So you have things like BHL Europe, BHL Australia, but then you also have things like BHL China, BHL Singapore, BHL Mexico, BHL Cielo, which is a note for Brazil, BHL Africa. I think those are the existing notes so far, and there were plans also to expand those partnerships to other places in the world. But the problem I see there too is when it's only a geographical approach. So in the case of BHL Mexico, for example, that's a very interesting case because one of the goals was explicitly to increase the presence of materials in Spanish in the library. So actually 99% of the materials coming from BHL Mexico are in Spanish. But then if you look at the collections, for example, of BHL China, and there are very few texts in Chinese or in other indigenous languages of China. So that's where you start thinking about, well, what does a partnership entail? So really, what is the mind frame that we have when we're trying to establish this partnership? So that's also part of the process. And in terms of what they have been doing, well, they worked with me. I did an internship with them at some point. They invited me to talk at one of their annual meetings. So I can tell you that they listen. And I was also invited to collaborate with them in their acknowledgement of harmful content. And that's also when I got to see how problematic partnerships can also be. As enriching as they can also be very problematic because everyone has different perspectives. And it was also quite interesting to see the degree to which certain institutions were willing or unwilling to kind of adopt that accountability of the materials and the histories that they have, So of course that's another problem too. But there is work being done, and I think they're kind of past the first stage, which is accumulation. And now it's more like, okay, so this is what we have accumulated. What do we do with it? And what are we missing? And so it's kind of like another stage. But I agree, it's really hard to find those places that mistakes that were done throughout the way, and now how do we correct them? And so, but that's what's more or less happening behind curtains with BHL. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea.
Yeah, that's great. And it kind of leads into the question, I don't know, you kind of answered this, but if you have any more to say on it, what Jen Sims asked, how is the BHL reacting to your research?
Mm-hmm.
And are they taking into consideration possible shifts in the work? I was thinking that as well as you were talking about this amazing research, I thought, not everyone is super happy to hear this.
Yeah, no, and at first, I remember when they first invited me to their annual meeting, I was a bit terrified to give that keynote, you know, and then to choose from all the data that I had, what can I actually really present? You know? And I was lucky enough that they were willing to really listen, despite me being very, very critical. I always say I love BHL, but I'm also incredibly critical of them. That's how it is. So I really admire their work, but I also realize that there's a lot of work that they need to do on top of the work that they have already done. So yes, it's really good, and it's really fortunate that they do listen. So far, the biggest change I've seen again is the acknowledgement of harmful content, and I gave some additions, especially regarding vocabulary and language for certain things there that were problematic, and they did incorporate those additions. So I see that as the biggest change that came from my work with them. But in terms of the collection, I'm not sure. I haven't seen that yet. I know they were having conversations around that, but I haven't seen any changes in the collections yet. So we'll see. Hopefully that will eventually happen. Yeah.
You make a very strong case. I hope that as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we may have time for one more question. If there is one more, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we're approaching the hour. So, but thank you so much, Dr. Ponce de la Vega. We really appreciate your time and your research, and it's a wonderful presentation. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for listening and sharing. And it's been a pleasure sharing my work with you, really. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending.
Also, I have to second that comment in chat. Your slides were absolutely gorgeous. I don't know where you got that slide deck from, but it is like
thank
perfect.
You. I have to confess that I spend way more time than I should looking for PowerPoint themes online.
I've been there.
Yeah, so I just really like having pretty slides. So yeah, but it can be a problem. So, but thank you. I'm glad you like them.
It's so nice when the content is so interesting and useful and aesthetically pleasing.
Thank you.
I like both.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Dr. Ponce de la Vega. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. And Lydia, I did save the chat, and I will also send you a link once the video is up on our STS YouTube. I will send you a link to that so that you have all of that available. So
perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your day.